seminar is co-hosted by Valentina de Brasi and myself. I'm the director of the I-LanD Research Center and professor of English language and translation at the University of Napoli L'Orientale. Valentina de Brasi is a second-year PhD student in international studies at L'Orientale as well, working on indigenous activism and social media. For those of you who are not familiar with our format, the I-LanD seminar series showcases conveners debating key issues in their fields of expertise. These seminars are designed as open spaces for exchange, where speakers are encouraged not only to present their work, but also to share insights, reflect on their methodological choices, and openly discuss challenges and pitfalls. Before we begin, I would like to warmly thank our speakers for accepting our invitation and for their academic generosity, which is, as we all know, something that we cannot take for granted in the current moment. We're also extremely proud and honored to have them with us today. The group of scholars joining us represents a remarkable level of expertise in the study of language and social media, and their work has significantly shaped and continues to shape the development of this field across different contexts and traditions. As an inter-university research center, I-LanD is particularly committed to creating spaces like this one. I-LanD is an independent interdisciplinary center for advanced studies in linguistics, social studies, and humanities, with a specific focus on diversity and identity from linguistic, cultural, and gender perspectives. It brings together scholars from Italian and international institutions who share common research interests and who are invested in critically engaging with the social worlds we inhabit. If you want to become a member of I-LanD and if you want to know more about us, you can visit our website. We will leave the link in the chat. Today's seminar sits very much at the heart of this mission. We are engaging with a field that has become central not only to linguistic research, but to understanding social life more broadly, that is social media discourse. Social media platforms are spaces where communication, identity construction, and public debate unfold on a daily basis, and where discourse does not simply reflect social realities, but actively participates in shaping them. As we all know, social media have fundamentally transformed the communicative landscape. They are participatory environments in which users do not simply consume content, but actively create, share, and co-construct meaning, often across multiple modes, combining text, image, and video. This has opened up unprecedented opportunities for linguists. For the first time, we're able to observe everyday interactions as they unfold in real time, including what has been described as small stories of daily life, seemingly simple narratives that nonetheless offer powerful insights into broader social, cultural, and ideological processes, and I'm sure we will be talking about it. At the same time, this richness comes with important challenges. Social media are not neutral spaces. They are shaped by platform affordances, algorithmic logics, and attention economies that influence what becomes visible, sayable, and shareable. This also brings us to their political dimension. Platforms have become key sites for the circulation of public discourse, for forms of activism, and also for the amplification of conflict and polarization. Everyday communicative practices, whether personal or collective, are deeply entangled with broader questions of power and representation. This is particularly evident when we consider issues of gender, identity, and ideology. Social media are spaces where gender discourses are continuously reproduced and contested, and where visibility can be both empowering and risky at the same time. They're also key arenas for the circulation of ideological positions, often embedded in routine interaction rather than in overtly political texts, which makes them even more challenging to analyze. Methodologically, this raises a number of complex questions. How do we collect and curate data in environments that are constantly changing? How do we address the ethical implications of working with publicly available but socially sensitive data? And how do we analyze discourse that is inherently multimodal, where meaning is distributed across text, image, sound, and platform-specific features? These are all issues that our speakers will try to address this afternoon. To this, we must now add another layer of complexity, the growing presence of artificial intelligence within social media ecosystems. I'm talking about AI-generated content mainly, as the boundaries between human and automatic discourse are becoming increasingly blurred, raising new questions about authorship, credibility, authenticity, and so on. The wider framework informing today's discussion is therefore the idea that a critical approach to social media discourse needs to operate across multiple dimensions. To explore this complexity, we're joined by a group of scholars whose work has been highly influential in shaping this field, each bringing different methodological and theoretical perspectives. Massimiliano Demata, Matteo di Cristofaro, Candice Edrington, Federica Formato, Alexandra Georgakopoulou, and Philip Seargeant. So rather than a series of isolated talks, what we hope to create today is an interdisciplinary conversation about how and also why we analyze language in digital environments. Let me briefly explain how we will proceed. We will introduce each speaker, one speaker at a time, and then give each of them around 10 minutes. Valentina, Brasi, and myself will alternate in introducing the speakers. To open the discussion, I would like to start with a general question that will guide our first round. Could you walk us through how you work with social media discourse in your research, perhaps by referring to a data set, a case, or a project you've been involved in? And with this, I would like to invite our first speaker, Alexandra Georgakopoulou. Alexandra is Professor of Discourse Analysis and Social Linguistics at King's College London. She has developed small stories research, a paradigm for the analysis of everyday life storytelling and identities, with a current focus on storytelling as curated communication on social media. She has co-authored and authored and edited 18 books, of which the latest volume is Influencer Discourse, Affective Relations and Identities, 2024. Forthcoming books include Analyzing Narrative Online, Affordances and Practices, Routledge with Anna Di Fina, and TikTok's short-form videos, The Stories We Tell, with Ruth Page Palgrave. She's the co-editor of the Routledge Research in Narrative, Interaction, and Discourse series. Thank you, Alexandra. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me well?
Yeah,
yes,
perfect.
Well, I'm delighted to be in this forum. It's a huge undertaking for us to try and condense at times long trajectories in the next 8 to 10 minutes. And I guess a key point I want to make is that this longitudinal tracking of mine of how storytelling facilities have evolved across social media platforms has often taken me to unanticipated places, leading me to think that the data sets were never pre-decided, but they kind of have emerged through sustained engagement with what is ever-changing communicative environments. And to capture this, I have methodologically adapted for discourse and narrative analysis, a technographic approach. And by technography, I mean a way of studying discourse. In my case, it's storytelling that involves tracking, in my case, in real time, the interplay of 3 dimensions. So I'm looking at platform discourses about stories, platform affordances, what can be done or cannot be done, and user practices, what people actually do. The key here is that these are not separable layers, they co-evolve. So methodologically, this leads to, as I've said, longitudinal tracking rather than one-off data sets. It leads to recursivity. Methods are adjusted as the object changes. And also it leads to a synergy of qualitative and quantitative approaches. For example, I may, as I have done, do some corpus tracking of keywords like moment, real, relatable, metadata patterns, views, likes, comments, and so on. But this always, in my case, and as a primarily qualitative analyst, feeds into fine-grained qualitative analysis, because meaning, is produced in situated practices. So I treat qualitative and quantitative modes as mutually informing modes of attention. And this approach, as Anna said, connects directly with my earlier work on small stories and positioning analysis. And I mean, small stories had shifted focus from big, coherent narratives to fleeting, fragmented, interactionally embedded tellings. So there was already a move towards the kind of the mundane, the banal of everyday discourse, partial storytelling, identities in the making. And in this way, small stories anticipated social media because they show that identity work can happen in brief moment-based tellings. One of the things that I have done with my work on social media is I have tried to use the terms of the late Jan Blommert, reimagine paradigms that I had worked on and indeed being, developing before. So I have been reimagining positioning analysis, a really influential framework within narrative analysis for the study of identities. And I've been asking in my more recent work, particularly on TikTok, short form videos, what happens to positioning when storytelling becomes platformed, multimodal, algorithmically circulated? And I'm suggesting that positioning needs to be expanded through, well, at least 3 processes, which I'll give as kind of takeaway points here. Obviously, with Ruth as well, we are working on a kind of a synergy between multimodality and small stories analysis for short form videos. And in our forthcoming book, we kind of take people by the hand in that. And there's a lot on multimodality in the other book that I've written with Anna Defina. But just in brief here, I'm looking at templatization in how story worlds are created, how stories are essentially nowadays told through formats and templates. I'm looking at recognition in the intersubjective work that's going on with stories, how audiences validate and co-construct stories that are told in the first place as relatable. And I'm looking also at mimification, how identities and storylines circulate, how we've got replicable figures. So identities are no longer just interactionally achieved, which we knew, but they are also very much formatted, they are recognition oriented, and they are circulatory. And as I've said, TikTok has been a key site for developing these ideas. And I'm showing in my work on short form video storytelling with diverse data from identity crisis videos, personal identity crisis videos, to sound memes and trends, to family, when formatted stories about conflict, when my mom does this, when your dad, and all this. So I'm looking at stories as multimodal ensembles, how they're relying on what I call intermodal densities, various quite conventionalized formatted ways in which different semiotic modes connect, and how they're shaped by story formats. And one key shift in terms of identities and how we present ourselves and our lives that I have identified, having worked with Instagram stories before and influencers, is the move from authenticity to relatability. So that is not just being real, but also being recognizable to others. And we do have highly personal experiences, but in recognizable, repeatable forms that become shared and curated and collectively ratified in comments. Right, so I've got 1.5 minutes now to say where I'm going with this. And more recently, I've been extending this work to storytelling with Gen AI, including ChatGPT, and actually using, for the first time so far, a rather exposing autoethnographic approach of a co-telling with ChatGPT of a personal crisis narrative over a few months, and this work is going to come out in Narrative Inquiry. And the question here became, when the cloud was lifted, and I thought, oh, maybe I can research this. The question wasn't that at the beginning, but the question became, what happens to narrative co-construction when one of the participants is actually non-human? And what I'm finding is how memory becomes very memory mediated, which is a big kind of affordance on those systems, how the AI system can retrieve, reshape, and reinsert past story elements, and this has implications for the trajectory of an ongoing storytelling, and of course it changes how narratives develop over time. So co-construction again is no longer just interactional, it's also infrastructural, it's memory enabled and partially outsourced. And I guess this raises new questions about agency, story ownership, and what counts as a teller. Now, so across these different strands, just to try and wrap up this Cook's tour, my work tries to show that discourse, in my case, narrative analysis, really needs to be adaptive and recursive on social media. Storytelling is increasingly formatted and deeply engineered and curated, and identities are produced through recognition and circulation. And as I said, ethnography for me is a way of holding these things together, not as separate methods as such, but as a way of following discourse as it evolves. And I'll stop here, and thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Alex. Valentina?
Yes, can you hear me? Yes, now I'm going to present our second speaker of today, Professor Massimiliano Demata. He is a full professor of English linguistics at the University of Catania. He has published widely on political and media discourse in the UK and USA, conspiracy theories, the language of populism, and discourses on borders, nationalism, and immigration. He has co-edited Conspiracy Theory Discourses, John Benjamin's 2022, and the Routledge Handbook of Discourse and Disinformation, Routledge 2023. His latest single-author monograph is Discourses of Nation and the Borders in the USA, Routledge 2022. He is also the editor of the Journal of Language and Discrimination, published by the University of Toronto Press. So, Professor Demata, the floor is yours.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me? Okay. Okay, great.
Great.
Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you very much, first of all, to Anna and Valentina for inviting me and for organizing this wonderful discussion with so many colleagues and friends. Now, I would like to take perhaps a slightly different approach from what Alexandra has just talked about. I would like to focus on the social-political dimension of discourse analysis, text production, identity, as well as epistemic issues, which are at the basis of my own work. And I would probably raise more questions than give like a definite answers. That's probably our job, actually, to ask questions, not just to give answers, I suppose. Well, I will start from a micro dimension on text and discourse, and my approach to that, and will then extend that to expand my reflection on a micro dimension, so society, in the hope of raising questions of the nature itself of discourse analysis in a period of crisis, polycrisis, transition, transformation. There's no shortage of terms to define what we are going through right now. And I will then return in a kind of dimension in the middle, so to speak, which will be about our approach, our methodologies, or my methodologies, and the possible future paths. Well, I will start, as I said, from my own perspective, which is that of someone who has an interest in social media and in the way they construct, legitimize, and spread discourses related to disinformation, misinformation, fake news, conspiracy theories, etc. That is to say, all those phenomena which somewhat challenge common assumptions about discourse, information, communication, as well as trying to establish new rules of truth, so to speak. The case studies I have analyzed in my own research are, first of all, of a mainly qualitative kind. I have looked at how disinformation and conspiracy theories have legitimized their own discourse by making it appear as legitimate, by normalizing it in their opposition to established discourse, and by making it appear as epistemologically alternative as well as true. As I said, I have used I've been using a mainly qualitative approach to discourse, in line mainly with critical discourse studies, and more specifically discourse historical approach. And in the analysis of disinformation and conspiracy theories, I have dealt with the manipulation and legitimation that are used in this kind of language, especially, of course, on social media. And I have analyzed, lately in the last 2 or 3 years, big conspiracies of big narratives like the Great Replacement, the activities of Alex Jones and Infowars, and histories of narratives such as the Haitian migrants who were caught allegedly eating cats and dogs just before the latest American US election. And I have used categories which are, in my analysis, which are quite well established, like, legitimation, Van Leeuwen, of course, manipulation, Van Dyck, etc. And I've looked at how conspiracy theories and disinformation have legitimized themselves by masking themselves, sometimes even by mimicking subalternity and alterity vis-a-vis a dominant discourse. And in so doing, I have effectively come to terms with the subtleties of the language used in these texts. I've been studying social media in terms of both production and reception reaction, i.e. looking at how texts are produced and legitimized in reaction to certain problems coming from some specific text producers. And two things are quite clear from my own research so far. Well, number one, which is quite well-established fact, social media texts are extremely polarized, and prosumers react on the basis of the affordances offered by social media themselves. And I think, as I said, we have known this for quite a long time. Number two, this polarized system of systems both represents and causes two or more different epistemological dimensions in which the epicenter of knowledge is not about what is true, but whether and how alternative or multiple truths can be constructed and legitimized. And in fact, they are. So these truths are co-constructed by social media users, or indeed the prosumers, who contribute actively to the construction of these alternative narratives. So micro and macro, so of course a big question remains, so something that I would consider like a huge elephant in the room, so to speak. So of course most of critical discourse studies was born and still developing on the basis of a top-down social framework, whereby we as analysts have to uncover the hidden strategies used by the dominant classes to exercise their hegemony on the subject. But what about now? What that we have come allegedly to the end of history, to say it with Fukuyama. So what should we do now, who are now living in the presence of relations of domination, of course, still, but in a world in which the ruler-ruled relationship can clearly take up new shapes and shades, especially if we look at the dynamics of social media. So we as analysts were supposed to uncover the hidden truth, to unmask whatever idiosyncrasies, manipulations, or contradictions were exercised and employed by the power, whatever the power is or was. However, who should we be doing this on behalf of, so to speak? So what should we do with social media, a framework in which indeed identities, emotions, and truths, plural, truths are continually questioned and reshaped? So there is, in many respects, I believe, a need of a transformational approach, which takes up and employs the critical in CDA or CDS, but also engages, I think, more solidly with the notions of change, transformation, and crisis at multiple levels, which results, in fact, as as discussions on disinformation and conspiracy theories can show very well, in different contrasting epistemologies. So we are not just looking at the discourses productions as negotiations of different semiotic systems along certain predetermined ideological and social axes, but we are looking at social media and the discourses in social media as sites of transformations. So social, semiotic, ideological transformations in which critique, creativity, and change take center stage. So not in cause and effect terms, but we should really try to catch the transformational essence of messages, interpretation, and truth. And clearly, of course, the advances in AI makes this absolutely not just imperative, but also somewhat natural in what we do as researchers and scholars. I will probably stop here. So
Okay, thank you very much, Massimiliano. We have already raised a number of important issues, and I'm sure we'll add more as we proceed. Now I'd like to invite Philip Seargeant, who is Professor of Language and Communication at the Open University, where he teaches and researches language and communication. He's the author of The Future of Language 2023 and Exploring World Englishes 2026, and co-editor of the English in the World 2013, the Routledge Handbook of English Language Studies 2018, and the Routledge Handbook of Discourse and Disinformation 2023. He is currently academic consultant for BBC Radio 4's Word of Mouth program and is a frequent contributor to publications such as Wired, The New Statesman, The New European, and Prospect. So, Philip, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna, both for that and for the invite more generally, and to Valentina as well. These sort of events are fascinating because you don't know what the other people are going to say. You don't know either how the other people are going to approach the general question. So I think my approach is going to be slightly different, both from Massimiliano's and Alex's, but hopefully of some interest despite that. A couple of introductory words. So the focus of my research nowadays, in the past it's the World English stuff is a little historical now, but in the part is mostly on political discourse and on persuasion and propaganda. Certain overlaps with Massimiliano's to the extent that we co-edited one of the books that was mentioned. So by its very nature, this is public discourse, and often with the explicit aim of influencing the public. So the public is both the audience, but also intrinsically part of the nature of the communication. And it's also discourse which is part of both social media and non-social media communication, or as Jan Blommert called it, the online-offline nexus. And I think this is particularly relevant for what I'm going to talk about today, and probably is an issue that hangs over the whole discussion. Okay, so to the main question, how does my work, or how do I work with social media discourse? What I want to do is take a slightly wide-angle perspective on the topic, and look at the question from, I suppose, what's a theoretical point of view rather than a methodological or methods-based perspective. And what I thought I'd do is I'd highlight a few questions that I find useful in thinking about when I'm approaching the act of analysis. On the one hand, these are fairly basic questions, so apologies if it sounds a bit simplistic, but I do think they can be extremely helpful in grounding the research you're doing, and also they're the sort of things that once you're in the analysis can often get lost, forgotten, or you move away from. So first point I want to suggest is that there's always two questions at play in any act of analysis. Firstly, there's the question of what does the text tell us about the nature of the social world? And I would argue that this is the main purpose of the analysis. So, for example, how does anti-immigration rhetoric on Twitter have an impact on the lives of immigrants and indeed on society more generally? And it's the impact that you're most concerned about, I would suggest. But secondly, there's the question, what does the act of analysis tell us about the nature of social media discourse, or perhaps more broadly, social media communication? So this is a more meta-analytic question. You're analysing the assumptions or the taken for granted categories that the research question is based on. So why do you suppose that analysing language on Twitter will have an impact on the lives of immigrants? These are the underlying assumptions of that original research question. And so what is it that language on Twitter specifically, or whichever platform you're looking at, does in the world? And I think you could argue that these are both parts of the same question, because you can't really understand what a text tells us about the nature of the social world without understanding the nature of social media discourse. As has already been commented on by both Alex and Massimiliano, the nature of the platform. So, for example, a text circulated on social media will mean or will create meaning in different ways from a text circulated by other types of social media or expression. So given this, I want to begin with the question of, I guess, what constitutes social media discourse and what we're actually doing when approaching the analysis of it. And the first basic point I want to suggest is that you always need a theory of social reality to engage in discourse analysis, or at least you need some initial theoretical assumptions about social reality. Without this, your conclusions about the effect or the impacts of the discourse are simply without foundation. As I say, this might seem an obvious point, but I often get frustrated that it's one that often appears to be overlooked, and it results in analysis which might be descriptively interesting, but hasn't any explanatory power. So, for example, the case of metaphors used about immigrants. A useful first step is certainly to identify and categorize these metaphors, but without a solid foundation of the relationship between metaphor use and social reality, you're going to open yourself up to the so what question. And I think that it's the examination of that that relationship between what you found in the descriptive part of it with what you think the effects, implications, and so forth are. But the other point to make with relation to this is that discourse analysis is both theory dependent, so you need this framework or these guidelines or initial sense of what your notion of social reality is, but it's also theory generating. So the detailed study of context-specific discourse can help us better understand that relationship between discourse and social reality, i.e. it informs your theory of social reality. If you're too dogmatic about your theory, you're going to be missing, especially as we were talking, as Anna was talking right at the beginning, the fluidity of social media discourse, the fluidity of any sort of the nature of communication. So it's both theory dependent. Without a theory, you're just describing things, but it can be theory generating, and it's an interesting and often, well, always complex relationship between the two. I suppose it should be noted that these 2 points apply to any discourse analysis. So the question then becomes, what, if anything, do they highlight specifically about social media discourse? And the very basic answer is a great deal. But given time constraints, I thought I'd just look at one key point, and that is the nature of context. As we all know, social media discourse has widened the nature of, or at least it's broadened the understanding of, discursive and sociolinguistic contexts. Context, of course, is what both speaker and audience use to make meaning, but the complexities of context for online communication and the dynamic nature of it, from in all aspects, be it from the algorithmic context, the different forms of new technologies which are changing what it means to author something and so forth. These are immense. So a key question when approaching social media discourse analysis for me is always, what does the data illuminate about the context which is drawn upon and thus shapes meaning? In the last couple of minutes, I'll briefly talk through, or at least make a couple of points around one particular example. There's one phenomenon that I'm particularly interested in at the moment, which is a genre of posts on social media, which might best be called a sort of amateur online CDA. So these are posts, and they're particularly popular on Twitter and Facebook, where the author criticizes the language that's used in a news article or a public statement in order to expose what they consider the implicit bias in the article or statement, which is, as Massimiliano was just saying, the assumption that the assumption and purpose behind what critical discourse analysis or critical discourse studies was doing from the beginning, and indeed going back to hermeneutics of suspicion, the idea that there are embedded realities or truths which the discourse analyst is able to uncover, explain, reveal, as it were. That's sort of what we're doing as discourse analysts. And you see, I think, quite often on social media, people doing this in a obviously truncated, simplified form. So one popular meme that takes this form, which you may know of, is the "fixed it for you" meme. In this, someone will take a headline about an event from the newspaper or from an online news source, then they'll cross out certain words and replace them with others to change the stress or the perspective on the event being reported. So they're critiquing how the original author or authors have framed something and offering what they see as a more accurate framing of it. So, for example, just to take a very a recent example, there was a headline in the BBC a couple of weeks ago, which read, "At least 153 dead after reported strike on school, Iran says." At least 153 dead after reported strike on school, Iran says. You could easily highlight the word dead, the verb dead, rather than, and change it to killed. You can query why it's reported rather than it's stated as a fact. Why does it have Iran said at the end? All these sort of things offer a particular perspective, and you often see little vignettes, as it were, like this on social media, where someone has highlighted the grammatical and word choice decisions that the author has supposedly met, which are presented as giving a very specific perspective on things. And this sort of thing is explicitly metalinguistic or metadiscursive. Particularly, it's an explicitly metalinguistic or metadiscursive intervention, and it's one in which a conflict over the use of language, over the choice of words, of the choice of the way something is expressed, becomes a proxy for conflict more generally, a conflict over a political issue more generally. So the language acts as a sort of, well, yeah, as a proxy. There's a sort of lexical proxyism, if that's a word, a lexical proxyism in the discourse, which is used to introduce a different political perspective. So how does this example fit with my sort of more very general questions that I began with? Firstly, it illustrates the assumptions that people, the posters, the people doing the posting, for example, have about language and about the relationship between discourse and social reality. The person doing this has a sense that there's an importance between this discourse and the phrasing and what's happening in the world. They wouldn't get upset about the way something's phrased if they didn't feel that it had this effect on the world. And even if the effect that they believe it has is more complicated than what they're expressing, which it invariably is going to be, or at least we hope it is, that's our job to highlight these complexities. Even if it's more complicated, the intervention itself then becomes an effect. So in a case like this, taking a skeptical stance to institutional media reports then leads to an undermining of trust in traditional institutions and so forth. So it has a knock-on effect. Secondly, I think a simple example like this shows how the affordances of social media are exploited. This sort of intervention is only possible, it's only really possible on social media as it involves grassroots intervention to an extent in political discourse, although there are some very interesting examples when then institutions themselves feed off this template, to use Alex's word, and repurpose it in a top-down way. And of course, it relies on the tools that are available on the same device that carries social media. So as Massimiliano said, there's the prosumer aspect of it. And then finally, it's propelled when it latches onto the wave of attention related to the topic it's addressing. Okay, so this is a very brief example. But what I wanted to try to highlight is that in approaching the analysis, key issues for me are always what's the text doing in the world? And for that, you need to relate the findings of the analysis, as I say, to an emergent theory of social reality. Simply being descriptive, to my mind, is not enough. And part of that then becomes what is it specifically about social media or the social media platform or the social media ecosystem that then influences, shapes, or maybe even to an extent creates this relationship between discourse and social reality. And I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you very much. I will now like to welcome Candice Edrington. Okay. So Dr. Candice Edrington is a self-identified scholar activist working as assistant professor of journalism and mass communications at the University of South Carolina, where she teaches undergraduate and graduate students the fundamental principles and theoretical foundations of public relations and strategic communication. Concurrently, she researches the intersections of social movements, strategic communication, and social media through a public relations lens. Authoring several scholarly articles and book chapters, her work is published both nationally and internationally in the Journal of Public Interest Communications, Visual Communication Quarterly, Social Media Plus Society, Public Relations Journal, the Journal of Public Relations Education, and the Journal of Mass Communication Quarterly. Then thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, and hello, everybody. Warm greetings from South Carolina. This is a very interesting conversation, and I'm glad to be a part of it. As I'm sitting here listening to the other speakers, I'm realizing that it's just so many ways to analyze social media discourse, and in thinking about my own ways of analyzing social media, it's kind of all over the place. And so, I'll take this time to kind of walk you through, as the first question, asks us, how I approach, my analysis with social media. So as I received these questions, I thought about the work that I've done so far, and I kind of want to take you guys on a journey because as I've done this work, my approaches have changed, and what I'm looking at has also changed. So just to give you a little background, I am a former practitioner in the public relations space. So coming into academia, all of my research is from a practical lens. And the basis of public relations is relationship building. And so that's the forefront of my approach to social media. In looking at public relations and social media, I focus on social movements and social movement organizations, advocacy groups, activist efforts, and how these groups are using social media to either A, build or enhance relationships, or B, to change relationships with their intended audiences, or sometimes not so intended audiences. And so as I begin to embark on studying social media from a social movement perspective, I think I kind of followed the trajectory of the Black Lives Matter movement and the different instances that has happened throughout it and where it has evolved. And so my interest really began, with Trayvon Martin in 2012 when we saw people posting on Facebook. And I'm from the era of Facebook where you had to have a college, email address before you could log on. And so right there was some form of gatekeeping with a social media platform because you had to be a college student or had gone to college in order to be on Facebook. And so, that was interesting within itself, the affordances of that particular platform at that time and the conversation that was happening on that social media platform. And then we get to 2014. So we fast forward about 2 years. Black Lives Matter didn't really take off that much after Trayvon Martin. It was casual conversation, but there wasn't really any movement, so to speak. And then we get to 2014. We have Michael Brown in Ferguson. And so we moved platforms from Facebook to Twitter. And that platform was open for everyone. We see people live tweeting from the ground in Ferguson, taking videos, sharing pictures, regardless of how graphic they may have been at that time, really giving us the news, being citizen journalists on the ground in Ferguson, Missouri at that time. And it was just interesting to see not being in Ferguson, but being in Ferguson at the same time. And so I really became interested in how discourse, like I said, it either enhances or builds a relationship or it changes a relationship, good, bad, or indifferent, really how the discourse moves. And so from there, I continued to look at platforms such as Instagram. Some of my work that I'm working on right now is going to explore TikTok, right? So when I'm looking at these platforms, I'm looking at a couple of things, and I have it written down here. First, the affordances of social media, right? What are we afforded? What capabilities are the users afforded on the platform? And are they using it the way that the platform was intended, or are they not? Are they creating new ways to use these platforms, right? Because I think that's what we begin to see when we saw Twitter. When Twitter exploded, people were building communities. And I don't think, I'm not the founder of Twitter, but I don't think that was the initial, intention behind Twitter, to build communities, maybe to connect conversation, but not necessarily to build communities. And so I think about the affordances of social media. I also think about the agency of the users of social media, right? So, social media is so different in many ways from traditional media. The gatekeepers are gone. We have a lot more freedom saying things we should or maybe should not say, but we have agency on social media platforms to say it. But not only the agency of the users, the intentionality of the post of users. And so I think I explore intentionality a lot in my work and thinking about what was the purpose of this, right? So you didn't post just to post. What did you hope the intended outcome would be? And when we talk about public relations and we look at work from a public relations perspective, public relations is strategy based, right? So these activist organizations, these social movements aren't just posting just to post. It is strategic, it is intentional, and there's meaning behind these posts. So the affordances of social media, the agency and intentionality from the users, but also the effects of the discourse and the dialogue, right? So when I talk about how conversation flows, but also what is the intended outcome, I want to explore the intended outcome. And that might not be immediate. That might be longitudinal, right? Because if we want to see change, it's going to happen over a period of time. So how does the discourse and the dialogue on social media shift? Does it shift over time? Do the outcomes change depending on what the topic is? And so those are kind of the three main things that I look for when I am researching certain things on social media. So I'll talk about a few of my works, few of my things that I'm talking about, I think I'm going to be talking about forever. Some of the things that I have written, and for the interest of time, I'll reduce it to about three of them. So I am a mixed methods scholar. So I look at quantitative and qualitative, more so heavy on the qualitative than the quantitative these days, but I do take a mixed methods approach. And like I said, I look at social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter or X. I also look at sentiment analysis. So I use software such as, it's had a couple of iterations and name changes. It started as Crimson Hexagon. It's now Brandwatch, I believe. But I use social media platforms such as that or software, to really gauge sentiment analysis. What does the public think about these words, this discourse, right? If it's coming from a social movement organization, if it's coming from a nonprofit group or advocacy group, how is the conversation affecting or impacting the people who are reading it or viewing it, right? So I think about those things. When I look at the visual, I'm looking at the interpretation, right? Because it's kind of hard. Maybe not hard, but for me, I look at images where I have a connection to, right? So the interpretation could be biased, and that could be one of the, concerns about research when you are doing interpretation, your bias. But I look at images and things that I have a connection to try to get an accurate interpretation or how I would interpret it from my perspective. So with the visual, I look at the interpretation. With the written, I look at the strategies behind it. So I look at the message strategies that are actually being used. And so I'll talk about, like I said, some of those works. So one of the first papers that I ever wrote, which is the one that I do think I'm going to be talking about forever, is Tweeting a Social Movement. And I wrote that back in 2018. And so that looked at Black Lives Matter over a 5-year period and looking at the intentional strategies or maybe unintentional strategies that were used in the messages that were tweeted directly from the social movement's official account. And so in that paper or that analysis, I was looking really for three things. Were they trying to share information, just share information about the movement since it was still kind of new, kind of early on? Were they trying to promote awareness of maybe some of the deaths that had been highlighted due to the movement, or were they really trying to build community? Was it a space to build community? And so, as I said, I looked at that over a 5-year period, and what I noticed was that the conversation changed as the years progressed. So in the beginning, it was just to simply share information, right? This is what the movement is. This is who we are. This is what we want to do. Then it progressed to promoting awareness, right? These are the things that are happening in our world right now. These are some of the key issues that we want to highlight through this movement. And then it kind of plateaued at building community. All of this information, I want to build community. I want the people who are probably our intended public, or maybe people who are not our intended public, to be in community with us. And so the conversation shifted. And that's really what I look for when I'm looking at the text. What does the conversation do? Not necessarily what it says, but what does it do, right? So we can see it plain as day what it says, but what are the outcomes of what it says? What does it do and how does it move? From there, I moved on to the visuals. This is probably the second paper I'm going to be talking about for the rest of my life, which is a great thing. Race and visibility. So this was a huge paper looking at some of the images from the Black Lives Matter movement that kind of came out that became iconic, so to speak. Some important images, but easily recognizable images that people could automatically attribute to the Black Lives Matter movement. And this paper was very special in that it was a visual analysis. It was my first time undertaking a visual analysis, but from the interpretation side, I also wanted to see, what do these images say, right? So not just what they are, but what do they say? And how does increasing certain images or making certain races visible, how does that shift the narrative, right? How does that change what people may or may not think about that particular race, may or may not think about that particular social movement and what it is doing? And so again, when I'm looking at the text, I'm looking at what the message does. When I'm looking at the image, I'm looking at how does it shift the narrative? How does it work to change? And so I did that. And then I also, one of my most recent papers, hashtag I am a Black man. This is an interesting paper because this was a mixed methods approach in not only interpreting the images, but also reaching out to viewers of the images to get their interpretation as well, to see if what I interpret the image of doing, if it actually did it, right? And so this hashtag, this was kind of an interesting paper because this hashtag kind of, I'm not going to say protest, this hashtag kind of movement, I guess you would say, hashtag activism, which happened on Instagram. It happened in 2020 after, the racial reckoning of 2020, when everybody was tuned in to social media, to the news, because we were on lockdown due to COVID-19. So everybody was attuned, right? And so we witnessed George Floyd, and then Black men took a stance on social media with this hashtag kind of activist campaign of sharing images of what Black men actually look like and what Black men actually do. So it was intentional to combat stereotypes, right? Stereotypes and caricatures that have been historically placed on Black men and the Black community in general, but more specifically Black men. And so looking at these images were pulled from users who had public pages on Instagram. And just to not only analyze the caption that went with the picture, but the images that they intentionally chose to portray themselves. So if you aren't familiar with the hashtag I am a Black man, the purpose of it was just for Black men to post one picture, whatever picture that they wanted to post on their Instagram page, just stating that I am a Black man. Like, I build people up, I don't tear people down, I'm not a threat, et cetera, et cetera. And just looking at the images that they chose to post, it was clear that it was intentional, but that it was also cultural projection, right? So choosing to project their culture and how they live in their culture to audiences who otherwise might not, engage with them or might not understand them. So you have Black men posting in suits, right? Black men showing professionalism, Black men with their children, showing that they are present fathers, Black men being peace officers, showing that they are peaceful and not angry or violent. And so that was very interesting But on the other side, it was interesting to get the feedback from audiences, the viewers who saw these images, to see if that message came across, right? If it was, in fact, cultural projection, if I am projecting my culture in a way that others would deem appropriate. And so it worked. And so I was glad to see that it did work in some of those images, right? And so I say all that to say that is what I'm interested in social media. So like I said, when I began, it's all over the place. I'm thinking about a lot of things a lot of the time, but I think how I think about social media honestly depends on the platform, what I want to look at and how I want to look at it. But all surrounds social movements and that advocacy landscape and how these organizations choose message strategies, certain strategies to build relationship with their audiences and their publics, but also how they promote certain images to change narratives and to shift conversations in favor of their efforts. And so I'll leave it there, but that's currently where I'm at, thinking about the visual, the written, the sentiment analysis, all the things all the time. So
Thank you, Candice. Thank you very much. Other key issues raised, and I think we both got an idea of the complexity of the scenario, and also in a way we're connecting some dots in a way. So we'll continue now with our next speaker, Federica Formato. Federica is a senior lecturer at the University of Brighton. She published on gendered and inclusive language, narratives of violence against women, masculinity, fatherhood, and language used to construct women in politics, mostly in the context of Italy. She's also the author of 2 monographs, Gender, Discourse, and Ideology in Italian, Palgrave 2019, and Feminism, Corpus-Based Research on Language Inclusivity, Cambridge University Press 2024. Federica, the floor is yours. You have 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Anna and Valentina, for inviting me. I'm so glad to be here because I actually got my first degree at L'Orientale. So it's kind of like going home.
Welcome back.
Yeah, and I can tell you that the universities, make you do amazing things after you're done. Okay, yeah. So I think I want to touch on some of the things that I heard from the other speakers, from Philip, from Candice. But I'm going also to talk about something because there is maybe this assumption that we should all study Anglophone, data. While for me, I started my PhD thinking about, Italian from several points of view. I didn't start when I did my PhD, it wasn't technically on social media. I then moved on, on studying social media from several perspectives. I'll touch upon some of my data, some that are a bit more possibly traditional and some that maybe are less traditional. Like I published a paper, the paper on fatherhood is actually me fighting with fathers on Twitter because they were basically like policing their daughter's sexuality. So I think that for me, studying Italy and Italian as a language has some relations to who I am, where I was born, where I was raised, but also is a way to kind of like give back. Sometimes it's difficult because I write in English, sometimes about the Italian grammar. So there are some new problems, or for example, the software that I use don't necessarily include all the complexities of Italian grammar, but there are also old problems, like how do I then compare the language or the grammatical structure or the discourses with other data sets that are maybe in different languages. But these old problems are actually, like the type of challenges that we like to face as analysts. I kind of like expanded on the idea of epistemological side that Jen Sunderland came up with when she said, okay, there are some spaces that are worth investigating. She actually meant very limited spaces like the classroom or, like small groups. While for me, I went quite further with that. And I said, well, actually, Italy is an epistemological site because there are so many things happening when it comes to sexism, when it comes to violence against women. So all the structure of how also historically gender and sexualities are then developed in, in different ways. It could be in personal opinions, or it could be in relation to discourses, or in relation to perceptions, attitudes, or representation, reception, also like Massimiliano was saying. So I think that studying this topic is, for me, this big topic. I kind of like have the flexibility of addressing my questions about gender and sexuality in Italy, or in Italian, from several points of view. You were mentioning my work around also male violence against women. There had been a lot done on other contexts, which really helped me to understand how this this issue is spread all around the world. Also, I was thinking, like there might be lots of students here, sometimes how you come up with the data set. And I think that is the funny part. I think that is in the interesting part. I love to build corpora, but I have to say that Matteo has helped with two of the corpora that I investigated. So I leave this part to him. But also, many of the things that I deal with are also talked in the public debate, that there's public debate about that, which makes me think about what Philip was saying about these metalinguistic practices that other people do, not just linguists, but that like sometimes journalists do, or other people who approach language. So I think that, and I hope that I transfer this to my students when I say this is the best part, because it's there that your investigation starts. I also want to touch a little bit on what Candice was saying about the activism, and how we can see ourselves as activists, but sometimes we don't possibly do it in the same spaces that we investigate, like social media, or sometimes we get to do it, but in a very weird way. Like yesterday, somebody was teaching me about grammatical gender in Italian. Obviously, they don't know who they are speaking with. So I'm like, okay, let me rephrase that. So I didn't obviously say, look, I've been writing on that for years, but how this position as activists in spaces where we don't have the same status as when we go to conferences, or when we speak, in this type of spaces. I also wanted to touch on the idea of social media that so far we have kind of like seen in isolation. So we spoke about TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, but then I did some work very recently on how Giorgia Meloni is constructed as a woman in politics in the Instagram comments underneath her posts before the electoral campaign of 2022. And we realized that actually there was this I wouldn't even know how to call it, maybe this fluidity, where, for example, Giorgia Meloni was actually posting a tweet or an answer to a tweet. So the space of social media is really much more open, maybe than we think. It's much more hybrid. I wrote this paper with Giulia Evolvi, who is a media scholar, digital religion as well, and I think that also these opened a new space for both of us to actually join forces on something that maybe we had seen from different perspectives. I do mostly quantitative, but obviously the qualitative elements always come up, and also it depends on what type of data do you have. For example, when I was fighting with these people, then I couldn't really use quantitative because I didn't have enough data to use quantitative. So I just wanted to dig into some of the discourses that was originating. When then I did the study on the gender inclusive morpheme joie, I actually moved to something like digital ethnography. And the idea of you're there, you're exploring, you're invisible, but it mostly because there is the corpus that you have collected is an archive. So you're not there as traditional ethnography, but you're still there to see what's happening, because I think Candice was mentioning metadata as well. So you kind of like reconnect. And so basically this idea of, like exploring and being there with the participants, they come with a lot of pros, but also some cons, because then you have to evaluate how you enter the conversations or how you enter the stories of these people, and how, for example, I decided not to include some of the most personal stories in my book, because I thought that, like the book would kind of like become an immortal type of product. And I didn't want, like to, even by deleting the handles or by deleting all identifiable information, you're still kind of like putting something down that could stay there for a long time. And actually it is fed more likely into AI. Another point I wanted to touch on, I don't know, like you tell me the timing, because
you have 1 minute.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Okay. No worries. I just want to finish with something that Philip mentioned that is very, very important for me, and that maybe I actually developed it later. So not in my PhD, but much later, the importance of theory to look after what's going on. So I use the framework of feminist critical discourse analysis, which isn't gender plus CDA, as Michel Lazar says. I think that framework we could all contribute to expand it, to advance it, because it's such a good point to start from the idea that actually patriarchal dynamics are at the core of everything that happens, specifically if we look at gender and sexuality. Okay,
Thank you, Federica. And now I would like to introduce our last speaker of this conversation, Matteo Di Cristofaro. Okay. Matteo Di Cristofaro is a corpus and discourse linguist, bridging digital humanities and NLP, author of Corpus Approaches to Language in Social Media, Routledge 2023. He lectures on corpus linguistics and digital humanities at Università degli Studi di Modena e Reggio Emilia. Thank you, Matteo, for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Anna and Valentina, for inviting me, and to the colleagues for offering such a rich picture on what social media discourse is. I will try to add my own bit, different from all the others, as it has been for the previous talks. So I come from corpus linguistics, so what I'm going to say, I would say mostly relates to quantitative approaches rather than qualitative approaches, even though qualitative approaches is what I've always tried to enable in a CAD's perspective. So I've been collecting data from social media platforms in general, from website to online fora, the dark web, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and you name it, for 15 years now. And things have changed quite a lot, and this is what I mostly focus on and what I would like to focus on today, that is those technical aspects that allow us and the people who work with us to have a corpus on which we can then run the analysis, because there can be, roughly speaking, no analysis if we don't have the data. And it's getting more and more difficult to have access to be able to collect or to gather data, in particular from the most famous and most adopted, say, social media platforms. I have been using mostly Python for the past 15 years, and the use of specialized tools to collect data from platforms such as I was mentioning, Facebook, Instagram, and so on. And things have changed very rapidly, in particular after the exponential growth of artificial intelligence LLMs that obviously need to feed on data, and therefore the companies who own the platforms on which data is produced, they are trying to limit the acquisition of this type of data as much as possible. So I think that as of now, this constitutes, in particular for us, but not just for us, for social scientists in general, given also the relevance that the discourses on social media have on the social reality, as Philip Seargeant was mentioning earlier. I think that this poses the major issue that we now have to face. How do we get the data? How do we collect the data? So this is, roughly speaking, the vast majority of what I've been working on and what I work on, together with, and this is where this links even more with the analysis of the social media discourse, the contextual information that we can gather, that we can have access to in social media platforms. I'm referring mostly to what is commonly named as metadata, or at least from the point of view of us as linguists. If we get the text from an Instagram post, yes, that is our data, but that post comes with a plethora of other pieces of information that the majority of the times we don't even know that they exist. I know for certain that there's, let's say for one Instagram post, we can gather, beside the actual text and the images, another more than 120 data points, pieces of information that are almost never used. And yet, if we look at the history of corpus linguistics in general, let's say metadata, think of the BNC. Think of how important it has been for researchers to know that that word or that sentence was uttered by a male or a female and by a person coming from a social class rather than another. Metadata has always provided us the means to have access to contextual information that shape language, and yet there's a lot of metadata that we don't even know it's there when we work with social media data that we have access to. So this is another important thing that I have focused on, that constitutes, let's say, my approach. So first, which data should we gather in order to answer the question? This is paramount. We can only answer our research questions if the data allows us to. Hence, data, let's say corpus design, shall we call it like that? It's a very broad category that which also includes very technical steps such as data pre-processing and so on. Then we have which pieces of data should we include. Let us not forget that data is never neutral and never objective. When we collect the data, we are effectively creating a data set from scratch based on what we need and what is our perspective, our subjective perspective. Hence, even deciding, shall I include the date on which the message was posted? Shall I include the type of account that the message was posted from? For example, on Instagram, content creators such as Chiara Ferragni, they have a set of labels that indicate that her account is not of the same type as my account, because she is a businesswoman, she's a professional working on Instagram. I am not. What should we do with this type of information? Can this help the research? My idea, and it's not just my idea, is obviously that yes, it matters, and yet we're always on the verge of being, let's say, going beyond what is commonly considered to be linguistics. Most of the colleagues often ask me, well, are you an IT programmer or a linguist? I'm not a programmer. I don't want to be one, but I need to know certain things in order to work with linguistics, at least from if we let's say if we approach this data from a quantitative corpus perspective. So this brings, once again, two of the main points of my approach. Which data should we gather in terms of data, textual data? Which data should we gather in terms of contextual information? And then the last bit, and I will close with this, Another thing that I think we should be concerned, and it's one of the things I've been working on, is okay, we have collected the data, we have all our metadata, we need to tag, to annotate the data in order to make it usable. However, we are facing now an issue where the standard taggers are not able to understand, let's say, 2 out of 5 words when we collect data from TikTok, from Instagram, from Facebook. Why is that so? Acronyms and the jargons and all those internet language stuff. I don't believe that there is one single language of social media. I believe that there are plenty of languages, but there are shared characteristics which can pose issues to traditional, to classic NLP tools. There's LLMs and AIs that can help us annotate. That is true. However, there is one issue with that. Beside the precision and so on, I'm mostly concerned with the fact that no matter what the temperature is, LLMs are never deterministic. Hence, we will never be able to tell to one of our colleagues, look, this is the data, this is how I worked with it, you can obtain the same results I did. It will never be possible. Hence, we need to revisit the way we work with data, at least, and at most, we should start also thinking about strategies that can complement what LLMs help us to do. There are things that we still need, because of the so-called scientific method, we still need to operate in a more human way, let's say in a more deterministic way, and yet the data we need to work on is so complex, is so varied, that traditional tools cannot really help us there. Hence, this should summarize what my approach is in terms of social media discourse. I do social media discourse mostly in the form of enabling my colleagues to do that. But in order to do that, I need to know what discourse is, what discourse studies is. And so I'm always trying to merge the two things together. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all the speaker for their insightful contribution. It's been really interesting to hear and fascinating to hear how your work connects with social media from very different angles. And we have touched on different perspectives, different approaches. We've talked about, you have talked about identities and small stories, but also the presence of multiple truths, or the collection of data, as we have just heard. I have a question myself. However, because maybe we are more on the late part of the evening, we would like to see if there are any questions from the public, and then maybe after I will ask my own question. And thank you again to everyone.
Yeah, let's see if there are any questions. In the meantime, while the audience thinks about questions, I would really like to thank you for this super inspiring moment. And I think it is quite clear that the topic is difficult, and there are many things to say. The scenario, as I said, is complex, but there are some things that came up. The reference to, for instance, agency, intentionality, the limits of the affordances, the issue of legitimation, what Alex said in the beginning about recognition-oriented small stories. I was very fascinated by all these things that came up, and that in a way really give us an idea of how there's so much to say about social media discourse. And even if it's something that we've been investigating for years now, there's still a need for transformation, as Massimiliano said, and also the data problem that Matteo mentioned in the end, the data problem. This is something that I think really brings everybody together, like the problem of how we gather data, the kind of data, the ethical aspects of gathering data. So, okay, I'll stop here. I'll leave this here. Let's see if there are any questions. And if there are no questions, we can, you know, continue on this trend. And I know that Valentina also has a question for you. So are there any questions from the public? You can raise your hand. Okay, I can't see anybody now, but Valentina, if you want to ask the question, or if anybody wants to pick up from what I said, any aspect of that concerning the data part, because I saw that you were particularly interested in the in this aspect.
Okay, then I will ask a question to all of you, because all of you, in a way or another, mentioned, of course, the presence of the audience or audiences that engage with content on social media, and the agency that also the audience might have, and also the fact that you know, some of them engage, as Professor Seargeant said, in what is amateur online CDA, which is something I've also witnessed because I have a passion for the comment section. So I usually go and check what the people are saying about, you know, what has been uploaded. And so my question is a bit connected to audiences because, of course, you presented, you know, several perspectives and also tools that can be used to and are used to analyze social media. And so how can these tools and these insights that, you know, they are developed in the academia, how can they be used outside of academia? Because people that, of course, that are not linguists, they are not social scientists or not academics, maybe may lack some of these tools. So how can they be, you know, brought outside the academic world?
Maybe I'll start. Oh, Philip, you go, please.
I just wanted to clarify. So are you suggesting how the tools themselves can, or how we can do a better job of engaging with the public, a broader public?
Sure,
in our
both. Okay, but both, if I'm being honest. Yes, I mentioned the tools, but, you know, also academics in general, yes.
I mean, one thing I find interesting is the question that I guess, I don't know if Candice brought it up directly, but to what extent is analysis a sort of activism? Or indeed, what extent academia is a sort of activism, and where you go with it? Because usually it's purpose-driven, as again Candice said, in terms of PR, but also in terms of you know, our raison d'etre, why we're doing this. We hope it's you start with an aim. You're not just necessarily not just doing it out of interest, although that's nothing wrong with doing it just out of interest. So how does one, as an academic, move, especially given that the barriers and the institutional framework in which, you know, writing a monograph results in a book of £120 or €130 or whatever it is, which no one's going to read. How does one make inroads into getting your own thoughts and insights and research findings beyond the closed circle, which I think is a really complicated problem and probably a different problem, but nonetheless something that is definitely worth considering and addressing.
I don't know if Federica wanted to add something.
Yeah, just a couple of things. This is such an interesting things, and also I was observing how some academics are actually doing that on social media. I think we have kind of like a complexity that maybe it is difficult to share, because like just starting from some terms, like that maybe are very familiar to us, are very like we know what they mean, but we don't have to assume that other people kind of like know. And then I think like recently I published this chapter with 2 other authors where we reflect on activism, like who gets to decide who is an activist, and sometimes even people who are against our ideological principles, they see themselves as activists. So like we can think of activism as a good thing, but to be fair, like there are also the people who think dramatically different from us, who might perceive themselves as activism. But also when you leave the realm of academia, which I'm not saying is like this idyllic place, but you also enter some other spaces that come with their own problems. For example, when you go into the publishing for non-academic audiences, then you have the problem that you are in a space where capitalism is key, where they have to sell things. And as I said, there are some things that are very similar in academia, but how these play out is that the same publishers then get to publish something, for example, in my experience, something that supports the use of gender inclusive language and something that doesn't support the use of gender inclusive language. So the ideological stance that you want to hope that also the publisher takes is not there, because they are interested in something else. So I think that it is when we leave the space that we know, that we usually, like are part of, then there are other things that come with it. And the ideological stance, I think it is lost into these dynamics of just capitalism. They have to sell books, so they'll get 2 different things and they'll publish both. And how do you navigate that space when you're trying to say this is not about democracy and the freedom of speech, this has more to do with like how to make money, but also how do you position yourself, you author position yourself in the neutral positioning of a publishing house.
Yeah, Alex.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing discussion. I've learned a lot. And I guess just to pick up on a couple of things in response to your question, Valentina. I mean, first of all, yeah, I agree with Federica that social media affordances in an interesting way have actually made it much easier than before to make our voices as academics heard beyond academia, if for those of us who want to do that. Now, the fact that our voices may be crowded out there outside of academia, it has dangers. I hear them. It may also be a sign of the times. It may also be that, hey, we've got a platform anyway, so maybe, maybe the fact that other voices get a platform, that may be an upside overall. But I'd like to take a step back a little bit when we discuss this, let me say the word that sometimes brings us shivers down the spine here in British academia, impact. So I'd like to take a step back and also say that whichever perspective we are looking at social media discourse from, we're not just analyzing language, right? We're analyzing how people make sense of their lives under specific social conditions. So because social media themselves are a lens on contemporary life. So even topics that may seemingly look like, to bring an example from my work now, latest work on TikTok. So what might look like personal storytelling, identity crisis, family conflict, is actually a way of collectively articulating really significant experiences for Gen Z, for instance, like precarity, like belonging or mental health. Okay, so I think that's one space where I would be defending work that is going on within academia, because it is a very crowded space, voices around social media. And we also have some obligations to the production of knowledge within our disciplines. So yeah, reaching out is one thing, but also continuing to produce knowledge within our respective disciplines, that's also a responsibility. Now, I feel that these insights are useful beyond academia, in areas like media literacy, education, platform design, because they can show how visibility, recognition, and participation actually work in practice. But of course, yeah, it's a matter of discussion as to what the avenues are and how we can maximize and we can mobilize opportunities for actually reaching out and talking across and speaking outside of academia. But I would also like us to take a minute and think about our responsibilities within academia as well.
Thank you, Alex. That was very powerful. Yes, Massimiliano, please jump in.
Yes, I just wanted to actually tail into this by just picking up on something that Philip had mentioned before when you mentioned the notion of amateur CDA or something like that. I think mentioning one particular example of somebody discussing manipulation of headlines and stuff like that. I think the interesting, which I agree with totally, but I think the interesting thing is that probably 30 or 40 years ago, we would not be having this discussion. So in other words, we would not have seen amateur CDA in action, so to speak. I know, by now, 2026, analyzing a headline in that way is like a CDA 101, so to speak. But still, the fact that I'm not implying that people who actually discuss language on social media they had like classes in linguistics with me, Philip, or Alexandra, or Anna, but or Candice. But certainly the fact that people discuss this thanks to the empowering and empowerment that social media have and the visibility actually have, I think that's not necessarily a bad thing. So just wanted to say that because he raises question also about something else that Philip, in fact, himself actually has said. So the importance of the theory of social reality, because really we are looking exactly at that when we look at this kind of comments on the internet, because on social, particularly on social media. I guess, I mean, that's why, the old rules, the way we grew up, and we some time ago as students first and then as scholars, now we are really seeing that, transforming under our own eyes, I think.
Could I very briefly jump back? Because there's an interesting point, firstly, to relate it, and I see that Selena has a hand up, so I'll be trying to be brief so we can...
there's also a question, yes.
Selena,
go ahead.
One of the interesting things is, yes, I think it's interesting that there's this sort of awareness of how there's this sort of localized amateur awareness of how language works, which is great, but it's also how it's used. Because one of the examples that stood out for me, usually the idea basically that from CDA and also from this amateur online CDA is that someone is critiquing a powerful institutional discourse, a particular powerful narrative, as Candice was talking about in hers, and trying to give a new one. There's a very good example that I would use if it was a longer thing, of where this exact same technique has been used by the White House to criticize the New York Times. And so then it turns in from a process of resistance to a process of bullying. And it fits very nicely with, I think it was Federica who was talking about, different people have different ideas of what activism is. And activism itself can be a particularly malign influence in the world. And I'd just like to link it very simply, very briefly back. Another point that Federica made, that the publishing industry more generally, that thrive, the capitalism beyond that thrives on conflict and on attention and so forth. And that, I think, as you said, Massimiliano, and your thing, polarization is almost built into social media, and indeed to other types of media, even the publishing industry. So, although yes, there's an interesting awareness of how language is being used and mobilized, or rather discourse is being used and mobilized, and that meta-linguistic thing it then fits in with this broader institutional pattern where Donald Trump will use that same technique to bully someone. Yeah, I'll leave it at that because, as you say, you've got a question from.
Thank you, Philip. Yeah, I just want to say something very briefly about the fact that we're talking about social media users and we're talking about the languages of social media. One interesting fact is, which is obvious, by the way, is how there are different uses of social media depending on the generations we're examining. What I noticed is that younger generations use likes, the share thing, stories on Instagram and on TikTok in a completely different way from the way we do that. And it's obvious. Of course, it is obvious, but this is something we must take into account and also understand, because I don't think we fully understand how younger generations are using social media nowadays. And also the emotional load that comes with certain actions on social media. And this is of great wide interest, I think, and this is something which should, think about. Maybe for the next edition of the seminars we could talk about it. But now it's time for a question from the audience. So I apologize with Selenia Anastasi. Sorry for for the wait. Can you open your microphone and ask your question?
No worries at all. It was interesting to me to listen to all of your answers. So thank you very much for all of the insights. So I have more kind of a comment. It's more a comment than a question, or maybe a question, but it's a very difficult one. So, I mean, in my opinion. So one challenge I keep running into when researching social media discourses or social media phenomena, broadly speaking, is the speed of it all. So by the time a study is done and published, the phenomenon you were looking at often already changed or even sometimes disappeared, replaced by something new. So, and somehow your results sometimes are already obsolete, let's say. And this is very frustrating to me, to be honest. So, do you think maybe there are strategies to deal with this, or it is actually a false problem? I don't know. I don't have a precise questions about it. It's more a comment. But yeah, this creates a lot of frustration. So at least for me. But thank you.
Yeah, feel free to open your microphone and answer.
Matteo, you go first, because I spoke.
Okay, thank you.
Twice, I've spoken twice.
Thank you. Well, it certainly is frustrating. I fully agree. I'm currently doing a research on cringe, online cringe. So you may imagine how many things are coming up and how different things are happening pretty much every day. One thing that I've started valuing, and I'm not saying this is the solution, but one thing I've started valuing is the distance. I need some time distance in order to fully understand also the impact that a certain phenomena may have had or may still has on the social reality. Mostly because, and I'm going back to what was mentioned by Anna at the very beginning, the algorithmic curation, we are all inside of our own little, it used to be called a bubble. Hence, even the data that I, for example, am collecting from YouTube through an anonymous account, I'm not logging in. I'm using the API to scrape data. However, the fact that I am collecting the data from Italy means that what I am collecting is biased. And maybe what I'm noticing now may be true, maybe not. I think that, and I know it sounds very, very cliche, but only time will tell if that something was really to be considered or not, or whether it is part of a smaller or a bigger picture. So yes, it is frustrating. I am finding it extremely frustrating to collect data about what is cringe. However, what the strategy I am adopting, and I'm surely I'm not the only one, is I am collecting data day by day for long periods of time, and then in 6 months, 1 year, we'll see what happens if that data was valuable. And this is another issue which I would list under the data accessibility issues.
Yeah. Thank you, Matteo. I don't know, Federica, maybe Federica and then Alex.
Alex, you go. It's fine.
Thank you. We're being kind, which is what we should be. Thank you very much. It's a really great question. I've discussed this endlessly with my PhD students, and obviously, other colleagues as well. But I'm optimistic here. I'm optimistic for slow research, and my own answer and strategy is actually technography. Because or any version, I don't want to just say technography, or any version of ethnography that brings in an element of historicity. I think we are lacking in genealogical perspectives on social media. I think there's perhaps too much pressure to chase the next platform, the next phenomenon, while what I think we should be doing is tracking shifting social practices. And once you do that, then what you realize, what I have realized, is that there is so much continuity, sometimes even boring and predictable continuity. And of course, there are other versions of continuity. We can talk about reconfigurations, right? We can talk about repurposings, rather than wholly novel phenomena. And I'm actually extending this line of thinking and working with digital stuff to AI, because there's also a kind of an assumption nowadays that, everything that we've done so far on social media doesn't apply because we're in Gen AI era and everything is different. But it's not. But we can see with storytelling that I've been tracking for such a long time, because it's such a primary mode of communication for us, essentially how we make sense of ourselves and others in space and time. And I can see how Gen AI storytelling practices, recipiency practices, really build on previously established and formatted phenomena across platforms. So I would say, please don't think that work that you've done is obsolete. Not at all. We need it as part of establishing this historical line of how practices have been changing in the landscape. Yeah.
Yeah, and I want to add something on that. I think that, you know, like the data is a means to come up with the social reality that we were speaking about, the idea of advancing this theory. So although we put a timestamp on the data because at some point we need to finish the collection because we have to do the study, what really counts is what comes out of this. How do we get the messy language? How do we make sense of that? And we do make sense of that through the theories. So for example, through critical discourse studies or FCDA or triangulations of different methodologies and different theoretical frameworks. So I think what counts, what stays, is actually our interpretation, and that our interpretation, I like the idea of this historicity, is what stays, what is relevant for what comes next. So it's not just about the data. I will say the data is just one way to get where we want to get, and this is the point. What is the most important part is where we get, and how these help us to investigate more data, investigate similar ideas. I don't think, you know, some of the things we study will go away very soon. You know, like I was thinking about immigration, or I was thinking about racism, or I was thinking about sexism. They're not going anywhere. So we are just building on what's going on to advance the knowledge that we will need for later.
Thank you. I think there is a question from Professor Balirano, and then maybe after, if it's okay with you, Professor Seargeant can, speak after.
Hi, Anna. Thank you. Well, it was a quite thought-provoking afternoon, so thank you very much. Now, I was actually wondering, our work as analysts necessarily changes now if we accept that social media language is not simply an extension of offline discourse. I would say it's more like a distinct discursive formation shaped based on semiotic prosody and multimodal affordances. As you were saying, Anna, language on social media constitutes such a specific variety. How can we really meaningfully analyze discursive practices that become slippery within the conditional context collapse on digital platforms? I mean, the language they use today keeps on changing, and it's also very difficult for us to really and fully understand, more specifically in highly multilingual environments such as TikTok, where posts and comments mobilize hybrid repertoires, translanguaging practices, and distributed semiotic resources. Which language and which level of language should we take as our primary object of analysis? I'm actually working on TikTok now, on all the TikTok we have about Mandami, and then all the posts and comments you have to that. They're not in English. They are in so many different languages. Should we prioritize the dominant verbal code, or rather adopt a fully multimodal and translingual approach that accounts for the entire semiotic ecology of the platform? So this is quite difficult. It's one of the issues we should actually raise, especially as analysts.
Okay, if I come in, Valentina. So
yes, of course.
I think that's a fascinating question, but can I just very briefly skip back to the previous one about time? Firstly, I think what Federica and Alex have already said is that time is part of the context. Time is part of the part of the data. Time needs to be part of your theory to an extent. So there's that. Just to complicate things, another time issue that often comes up with social media or any sort of digital media is the future. I wrote a book a few years ago about emojis, and every single time I did an interview about it, it was, what is the future of emojis? It is a flippant question to an extent, but it's also not a flippant question, because although I think Federica's right, is, you know, sexism isn't going away, fascism isn't going away, all these problems aren't going away. If we're talking of a purpose-oriented focus to the analysis and the notion of impact, to some extent it is how we predict what's going to happen so that we can get a better hold on it. So the future is also is also part of that notion of time. It'll depend, obviously, on what it is you're looking at, but time is always part of it. But that should be a positive rather than negative. That doesn't mean if something comes obsolete, it means that thinking about how time works in your particular thing is of importance. What was Giuseppe's question? It was about the focus. I don't know if someone else wants to come in first on that. Alex, go on.
Yeah, this is another fascinating question that has puzzled us a lot, particularly on TikTok, because on TikTok, you have a whole semiotic ecology going on, and we go with that. We do not tease out the video. Oh, we're just doing the video. We are looking at the whole ecology. We are looking, well, at rich points within the whole ecology, because you can never be fully comprehensive, but we are absolutely looking at comments as well. We've calculated that in 250 comments on average, we find 8 languages, not necessarily European languages. So, but I was just thinking of research pre-digitally, where actually to think that you're working with monolingual data, for instance, that was a fallacy, right? So what's new in some, obviously the scale is different and unprecedented, but what we are seeing on social media is really overlapping repertoires, ways of speaking, showing, telling, that are shaped by affordances, as we've said, but they're also circulate. And that's the interesting thing for me about this type of work, which gives perhaps a point of entry. How do those things circulate across communities? How do they become recognizable within and across contexts? And how are they always locally adapted? Which is what happens with languages, so or trans languages, and sharedness in that way is something that I'm also interested in looking. How do shared formats and practices that travel, mutate, get recontextualized across platforms and groups? How do those develop? But it is complex work. I mean, I'll agree with you on this.
Can I just come back in very briefly? I mean, I think that, to my mind, it goes back to that point I was making, that analysis is both theory dependent but also theory generating. And if you look at the history of discourse analysis, it started, well, or linguistics more generally, it started very, very narrowly focused and has taken more, very crude terms, has taken more and more consideration of the role that context and the affordances and so forth play in the action of media meaning making. And so I think lots of the tools that were being developed not pre the digital era, but certainly pre the social media era, especially around language and globalization, discourses of globalization, they produce a very good foundation from which then we're able to do the sorts of things that Alex is talking about. But it's a constant generation process as well.
Okay, I wish we had more time to continue this conversation, but unfortunately our time's up, so we really have to close this session and say goodbye. But I really wanted to thank again our speakers, because this was extremely interesting, and I'm sure the many students and young scholars that have joined us today agree on this. I'm also very sorry that I cannot invite you out for a glass of wine and a pizza, but maybe sometime in the future we'll do that. Hopefully we'll see each other soon in person. But I also wanted to mention that we started off this seminar with an audience of almost 60 people, and this is not something that is obvious nowadays, because it's becoming more and more difficult for people to join the events online for some reason. I mean, I understand that. It's true, it's fair. So I really wanted to thank you because, of course, the people that joined us were interested in listening to what you had to say. So thank you very much again. It was wonderful. Let's do this again soon. And I hope you had a good time with us, and I'll see you soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was
Yeah, thank you
wonderful.
very much.
Thank you,
Thank
Anna
you.
and Valentina.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
Ciao.
very
Bye-bye.
much.
Ciao. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Let's go for
Ciao.
this slice of pizza now.
Oh, yeah,
But it
please.
won't be like what you'd be in Napoli.
Please, whenever you
Bye.
want, Alex, whenever you want, we're here. Ciao.